31-year-old man who admitted to killing victims in his apartment, then dismembering their bodies, may have murdered up to 17 people.
A serial killer is on the loose in the Daytona area.
Investigators are on the trail of a possible serial killer.
A stunning claim from an accused killer awaiting trial in Pennsylvania.
And authorities believe they could very well have a serial killer in custody.
And they say it may be the work of a serial killer.
An accused serial killer in
Welcome to another bone-chilling episode of 5 Minutes of Murder, the segment where I get to profile one of the world's real-life monsters, that of the serial killer, so we can get a better look at what it is that makes these people tick. On this episode, we're going to jump all the way across the pond and get a gander at a murderer, a pedophile, a rapist, and a cannibal guilty for at least 15 or more deaths. Yes, we're talking about Britain's own Muswell Hills murderer, Dennis Nilsen. Born November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh's Aberdeenshire, Scotland, the second of three children. His father was a Norwegian soldier who was part of the Free Norwegian forces that were followed after the Nazi occupation of Norway. Not much is known of his childhood, other than him often referring to his home life as being stifling. His parents would soon get a divorce in 1948, leaving him to be raised without a father, and his mother basically who was constantly working, so he basically had no one. Now, at the onset of puberty, Nilsen discovered that he was, in fact, a homosexual, which initially confused him and shamed him, because back then, it was a very different set of standards. Then, at the age of 14, with a potential avenue for escaping his family, he joined the British Army. After leaving the Army in 1972, Nilsen joined the Metropolitan Police Training School in Henderson. He passed a 16-week course where he would be sent down to Wilson Green Police to become basically a law enforcement officer. Everything seemed normal in the life of Dennis Nilsen until around December 29, 1978, where he met a 14-year-old boy by the name of Stephen Dean Holmes. Nilsen met the young boy at a pub and invited him to his home at 23 Crandall Gardens. It was there they continued to drink and eventually crawled into bed together. When Nilsen woke up, however, he found Holmes trying to leave. Basically, this feeling of losing control of the situation and the abandonment, it triggered. And Nilsen grabbed his tie, threw it around the neck of Holmes from behind, and began to strangle him until he was unconscious. He wasn't quite dead yet, so Nilsen went quickly into the kitchen and filled this large pot he had with water that was on the stove. He picked Holmes' limp body up and placed his head right directly into the pot face down. Once face down, he basically held him there until the bubbles stopped coming up. He then saved Holmes' corpse under the floorboards for at least 7.5 months, until he basically took it out of there and then he burned it with the remains of him and a couple other people in a bonfire. He actually had to add rubber to the fire to mask the smell of burning flesh. It was in this flat that Dennis Nilsen would go on to kill 6 more victims. But he also developed a ritual of sorts where he would have sex with, chop up, boil, cook, and sometimes actually eat his victims. He admitted to engaging in masturbation when he viewed the new bodies of several of his victims, and he also engaged in sexual acts with several of the body's victims.
It seemed as if he killed the people that he really wanted to stay, the people he'd taken home with him, that he liked. The fact that they wanted to go at midnight, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, was the trigger, I think, in many of those cases.
Dennis's killings were clearly motivated by his sexual needs, but I feel that these are very much secondary to his emotional needs. This is really a pathetic character. He needs to feel powerful, and it's this feeling of power and having ultimate control over another person which I feel are absolutely central to the killings and to all of the fantasy and the ritual that was built up around the killing.
Between November 1980 and May 1981, Nilsen would kill an additional 7 men who were never identified, since Nilsen himself had no idea of their identity, and any evidence that they had at the time, well, it got destroyed by Nilsen. The killing did not stop until January 26, 1983, when Nilsen would kill his last victim, 20-year-old Steve Sinclair. Now, Steve was this local guy. He was a local transient and a drug addict. Witnesses recall seeing him leaving a local park with someone who would fit Nilsen's description later on. And it was back to Nilsen's house where Sinclair fell asleep in a drug and alcohol-induced stupor, basically in the armchair. As Nilsen sat there while this was going on, listening to the rock opera Tommy. Nilsen then approached Sinclair, then knelt down before him and said to himself, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again," before strangling Sinclair to death with some twine. He then proceeded to sleep with Sinclair's corpse for several days. Like many of the other victims before Sinclair, the body was subsequently dissected, and the various parts were dismembered, wrapped up in plastic bags, and hidden amongst the house and in the floorboards. Basically, he stored it there, here, there, everywhere. He stored it in the wardrobe, or within this drawer that was located beneath the bathtub. Nelson's attempt to dispose of the flesh, the internal organs, and the smaller bones of all the 3 victims killed at Crandall Gardens by flushing them down the toilet, basically dissecting the remains and getting them in the toilet. He also would boil the heads, hands, and feet to remove more of the flesh, so the sections of the body's victims would be more easy to hide. On February 4th, 1983, Nilsen wrote a letter of complaint to the estate's agents complaining that the drains of the Crandall Gardens were blocked, and that the situation for both himself and the other tenants at the property was totally intolerable. How could this be? Unbeknownst to him, this would be his undoing. Strange enough, because on February 9th, 1983, the police would receive a call that would change everything. A sewer drain in the area of Muswell Hill was blocked with what was being perceived as human remains.
I remember with our scenes of crime officer taking possession of 3 little pieces of flesh and 3 small bones. The bones had a knuckle at each end, and they seemed to be about 2.5 inches long, and it looked as if they'd come from a human hand.
It was all first discovered by Dino Rod, which is basically like the UK version of Roto-Rooter, if you will. Basically, they go around and they fix plumbing and drains and so on and so forth. Employee Michael Cataran responded to the complaints made by the tenants of 23 Crandall Gardens regarding that the drains were blocked in the property. So he basically showed up there that next day and went to work, opening the drain cover that was upon the side of the house. It was there he discovered the drain was packed full of like a flesh-like gelatinous substance, numerous small bones of unknown origin, really not knowing what it was. Now, upon hearing that this similar substance was like human flesh, Nilsen replied, he said, "Looks like to me somebody's been flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken." At 7:30 a.m. the following morning, Michael Cataran returned to find that the drain had mysteriously been cleared totally. How'd that happen? He immediately called the police. Now, upon the police inspecting this whole thing, it was determined that the remaining small bones and scraps of flesh that was still there, left there, were in fact human. Just in case, the remains were taken to the local mortuary, and that fact was confirmed. These parts were for a human being. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and 2 of his colleagues showed up and opted to wait outside 23 Crandall Gardens to wait for Nilsen until he returned home to basically inquire about the blockage. It was there that Nilsen was basically detained, because at the time that the officers got there, all 3 of the officers immediately noticed an odor of rotting flesh coming from his flat. Nilsen queried, why were police even interested in his drains? I mean, what's the story here? To which he was informed that the blockage that they had the other day was caused by human remains. Now, Nilsen acted shocked. He totally acted bewildered. He said, "Good grief, how awful." "Whoa, oh no." In response, DCI-J replied, "Don't mess about, boy. Where's the rest of the body?" It was right then where Nilsen responded calmly that the rest of the body parts could be found in 2 plastic bags right by the nearby wardrobe. He then added, "It's a long story. It goes back a long, long time. I will tell you guys everything. I just want to get this off my chest. Just not here. Can we do this at the police station?" Dennis Nilsen was then arrested on suspicion of murder. He was escorted to the police station, where Nilsen was asked basically by the detectives at the time whether the remains of this person on the flat was that 1 person or 2. Nilsen, staring out the car window, basically replied, "More like 15 or 16. That evening, a Detective Superintendent Chambers accompanied Peter J. and Professor David Bowen back to the Crandall Gardens.
As soon as you opened the door, the smell intensified, and I closed it straight away, and I said, "We'll deal with that later." When we arrested Nilsen at Crandall Gardens, there were actually the remains of 3 bodies there. One had been dead a week, one 9 months, and the other 18 months. So 2 of them were in a bad state of decomposition, but most of the flesh had been taken from the bones, because what he was doing was stripping the flesh from the bones, flushing it down the toilet, and then on some occasions putting the bones out for the dustmen.
On October 24th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was brought to trial, charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. The jury retired to consider their verdict on November 3rd. And what's really kind of funny, just one day, the jury returned with a majority verdict of guilty upon 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. There was no fooling anybody. Dennis Nilsen was sentenced right then and there to life imprisonment with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 25 years. On May 12, 2018, Dennis Nilsen was taken to the hospital after complaining about some stomach pains. He later suffered a blood clot in the hospital and died, still a prisoner that whole entire time. In an interview right before his death, Nilsen was questioned by media as whether he had any remorse for his crimes. And Nilsen replied basically, I wished I could. I wished. I couldn't stop, but I could, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or no other happiness. He also took emphasis that he took no pleasure from the act of killing, but he, quote, worshipped the art of the act of death. So there you have it, folks. Britain's own Dennis Nilsen. One sick as hell individual who, I have to say, I'm glad is no longer walking among us today.
He did say to me once, "It's as well you caught me when you did, because if it hadn't have been now with 15 victims, it would have been later with 150.
I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. And once again, remember, always to lock your doors and windows, because you never know when it's going to be your 5 minutes that are up. Peace.